following program is a Springer Podcast Network production.
The following episode contains discussions involving toxic friendships, manipulation, mental health struggles, alleged inappropriate relationships involving minors, and references to suicidal statements. Some listeners may find these topics disturbing or triggering. Certain names and identifying details have been changed or omitted to protect the privacy of individuals who are not public figures. This episode reflects Cody's personal experiences, memories, and opinions regarding events that occurred many years ago. Other people involved may remember events differently. The purpose of this episode is not to harass, threaten, or encourage hostility toward anyone. It is a reflection on friendship, trust, accountability, and the lessons Cody learned from those experiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Cody Springer Show. This is episode 140, and this particular episode might feel like rehashing, might feel like, talking about ancient history because it is something that happened about 8 years ago. But I feel like it's important now to reflect on this particular story. When I came back a couple weeks ago, my first episode in 4 years, I talked about, I learned a lot, and then I reflected on a lot of things while I was away from the microphone. And this subject right here is one of those things. And I'm just going to get this out of the way. You saw the disclaimer at the start of the episode, but I'm going to say this right now. The only people that will be identified in this particular story is going to be me, Cody Springer, and then Ellis Omega, Randall Burnett, whoever you want to refer to him as. And then Marcel Salcido and Matt King. And the reason why only these four people, which includes myself, are going to be identified is because we're all, at one point, we're public figures. Me being a podcaster, content creator, Randall being a musician, Marcel, who was a former content creator at one point in time, and then Matt, who is or was a musician. I don't know if he is now, but because I have had no contact whatsoever with any of these people over this last period of 8 to 6 years. So it has been a long time since I've been talking about any of these people in this story. And I did an episode about this years ago, back in 2018. Marcel and I did this particular podcast about Ellis Omega, aka Randall Burnett, and that was kind of like us really just being pissed off and bashing him and just acting off of emotion. But this episode is going to be more so a reflection, not so much of a hit piece, because that's not what I want this to be about. This podcast is not intended to be a hit piece rehashed once again. I don't want people to think that, because I'm not making this episode to attack anyone. I'm making it because I've spent time reflecting on this particular portion of my life. And I think, it's important for me to talk about it and share with you guys on what I learned and what I reflected on. Because this isn't a story about who was right and who was wrong. This is a story about friendship, loyalty, and realizing that sometimes people aren't who you thought they were. That's basically what this episode is all about. All right, so let's talk about when I met Randall. Because I don't want to refer to him as Ellis, because I knew him as Randall Burnett. I did not know him as Ellis Omega. I didn't know the musician. I knew the person behind the musician. So let's go to the beginning, where I met Randall for the very first time. And basically, I was with someone at the time. We were living together at her grandparents' house. We were kind of figuring things out. I was just moving out of my 1-bedroom apartment in Van Wert. I lived on Washington Street. It was next to a gas station and next to the county jail. So I lived there for a while, and then I met this girl at work, and we got into a relationship, and then next thing I know, I'm living with her at her grandparents' house. And then one night we decided that we were going to have a party amongst us and friends, and Randall was one of the people that came to this particular party. So that's our very first interaction, the very first time that we met. And, I didn't really know him, or I didn't really, have any real opinion of him at the time. But I guess what it was, he wanted to come to the party. And the deal was that if he bought my girlfriend at the time a bottle of Captain Morgan, that he could come to the party and chill with us and all that. So he did. And then, she got drunk, like piss drunk. It was bad, man. She was emotional, crying and everything. And I did what I did to, try to help her through that. But yeah, so yeah, that was the very first time that Randall and I actually met in person. But I wouldn't say we became friends that night. No. That was our very first introduction. But little did I know that months later we would become friends. Cause that girlfriend that I mentioned, her and I broke up. And, I moved to a 1-bedroom apartment that was, kind of on the north side of town. It was close by Walmart. And so I moved there, her and I went our separate ways. And then, I heard that Randall applied for McDonald's. That's where I worked. I was a manager at McDonald's at the time, and Randall had worked there before, but he was leaving by the time I started. So I didn't, meet him then either. So yeah, so they hired Randall back to McDonald's, and that's when he and I started to really talk, and we got to know each other a bit better. We found out that we both liked professional wrestling. That's what really got us talking and starting to get to know each other. That was the real icebreaker right there. And then one night, he told me like, hey, let's hang out. Let's hang out and do something. Do you like to drink? And I'm like, yeah, on occasion. So, he told me that he would bring the vodka and stuff like that, and we would hang out. So then, so we agreed to hang out. And then when he came over, he knocked on my door, and I answered, and I'm like, oh, hey, what's up, Randall? And then, he was not in a good place. Like, he took the vodka bottle and he chucked it, threw it, and he was like upset. And I was like, hey man, what's going on? And then come to find out his girlfriend at the time cheated on him. And he was devastated, just outright devastated. And, he wanted to burn stuff that she gave him. Like, just destroy the shit that she gave him. And he was like really just distraught and upset that she did what she did. And I felt bad for him. I mean, anybody would in that situation, like, it sucks when someone gets cheated on by their significant other, it's crushing, heartbreaking, someone that you trust, someone you love just does that to you. It kills you inside. It really does. So I got Randall to calm down. We drank, and, he calmed down. He started talking to me more. And then I feel like that's when he started to trust me. And I would say that was more so the night that we became friends and we got close to each other, because I was there for him in a very dark moment in his life. And then from there, we just started, being really good friends. And I think I was helping him get through that really hard time in his life. And then we just enjoyed each other's company. Like I said, we liked wrestling. So we were watching WWE together, and yeah, we just sat down and talked, and then he told me about his music stuff. And yeah, I mean, we just enjoyed each other's company. And then we were going to the gym and, just hanging out a lot, and, we were just bros, I mean, just to put it into perspective, and I think he really enjoyed being around me and I enjoyed being around him. And we were starting to build up that strong friendship, during the beginning. All right, so now, like I said, Randall and I building up that strong friendship, feeling like brothers. And then it was getting to the point where, I was bringing Marcel into the whole thing. And then I'm telling you guys right now, Randall, Marcel, and I, we were inseparable. We really were. We were hanging out constantly. Like, if we weren't at work, we were basically at my apartment hanging out. And at this point, Randall had actually decided to move in with me because he was living with his ex-brother-in-law, which that's kind of awkward, but, he was kind of just living there and he wasn't really happy about the arrangement. And so I offered, because things were going so well with Randall and I said, like, well, do you want to move in with me? And then, you can help, pay half the bills and stuff and, and live with me. And he said, yeah, that'd be great, actually. So Randall actually moved in with me. And yeah, the three of us, me, Randall, and Marcel, yeah, we would hang out, just watch TV, play video games together. And like I said, we were all inseparable. And then that graduated into us drinking all the time, smoking weed all the time. And I just want to preface this by saying when you're living that life every day, you don't always see things clearly, you know, because that if I wasn't at work, when Randall and I weren't at work, that's what me, him, and Marcel would practically be doing. Like he you know, Marcel, he was living with his mom. He'd come over to my apartment, and then me, him, and Randall, we would drink, smoke weed, you know. So yeah, it was basically getting drunk and getting high almost every day, every night type of deal, you know. Because I think what it was is that the three of us were, we didn't realize it at the time, but we were all self-medicating because we did not like how our lives were going. We all three were dealing with depression, anxiety, and we did not know how to cope. So instead of going to therapy and, you know, working through things in a healthy way, that's what we were doing. You know, we were getting high, getting drunk, you know, just, you know, totally just, yeah. Anyway we could not be sober, we would do, you know. And here's the thing, people are going to take that the wrong way. We did not do any hardcore drugs ever. You know, no coke, no heroin, nothing like that. And I wouldn't even touch that shit at all. But yeah, we would drink alcohol, we would smoke weed, you know. But then, you know, Randall, he was starting to get more gigs, you know, more places that he could perform at. And, you know, we would go to his shows. But the problem is, like, Marcel, he was 18 at the time. I was 27, and Randall was like 20, 21 or 22. So, like, there were some places where, like, no, Marcel was older than that. He was like 19, 20 years old. And then, yeah, Randall was like 21, 22. So, like, Randall was like a year older than Marcel. So that there were some gigs that Marcel couldn't come to because they were in bars. Like, there was the Wet Spot in Decatur, Indiana, that he performed at quite frequently. He had to be 21 to enter. So Marcel could not come to certain shows because he was underage. And the only time he really could come is like if it was like Angola, like the coffee shop that he performed at sometimes. But yeah, I mean, I'm telling you guys, we were just inseparable for a period of time. You know, we were constantly just hanging out, and then, you know, we'd be making some not so good decisions as well, like the drinking all the time and smoking weed, and, you know, and yeah. But like I said, you know, that was our life for a period of time. And like I said, when you're living that life every day, you don't always see things clearly. All right, now I want to talk about the first cracks that I started to see in my friendship with Randall. And this particular girl right here, she is a big part of the story. But like I said in the disclaimer, certain names would be changed in order to protect people's privacy. So I'm going to call this girl right here Emily. And Randall was obsessed with Emily. He would constantly talk about her, and he would find ways to bring her up in conversation. And, you know, they first met at work, and then they started to talk more, and she was only 16 at the time. And Randall was 21, 22 at the time. And yeah, man, it became pretty strange to me, because like, and this was kind of like my first like thing that gave me pause, because like I could tell that Randall was becoming infatuated with her. And I was just thinking to myself, I'm like, she's 16 years old, dude. Like, come on, man. Like, you cannot be like this infatuated with a 16-year-old. But, they started hanging out outside of work, and they were mostly around me. And I'm just going to say this right now, nothing sexual ever happened between Emily and Randall. Nothing ever happened. So things really blew up at work over this whole situation because there was another manager at this place, and for the purpose of storytelling, I'm going to call this person Karen. Karen called Emily's mother and told them that her and Randall were having sex. And like I said, that didn't happen at all. And then, like I said, it blew up at work. Everybody knew about these rumors. And then one day in the morning, Randall got a phone call from the sheriff's department. And he told Randall that he was not allowed to have any contact with Emily, or else he'd be brought up on charges. And Randall understood and, left it at that. And then when he came into work, our boss told him that basically him and Emily could not work together. They couldn't like text or call each other, or else it would just open up a whole nother can of worms that Randall pretty much didn't want. And yeah, it just became a strange thing, man. It really did. So, Randall could not talk to Emily, could not work with Emily, but he'd still talk about her. And it got to a point where he said that, when he finally does release his next EP, that it was going to be dedicated to her. And I was just like, wait, what? Like I said, it was just strange. It was weird. I didn't like it, in all honesty. And Randall knew I was uncomfortable with the whole thing, but he just kept openly telling me about how he felt about Emily. But yeah, let's switch gears here and talk about Marcel again, because like I told you guys before, Marcel, Randall, and I, we were inseparable. We were like brothers, and we would even call each other brothers. We were that close with each other. And then Marcel told me and Randall one day that he was like, hey guys, I've been having really a fun time with both of you, but I really got to start getting my life together. Here's the thing, Marcel worked at this McDonald's that Randall and I worked at, but he got fired from this particular McDonald's over something so stupid. But like I said, he said that he was trying to focus on improving his life. He had to get a job, and he had to step away from us for a little bit so that way he could focus on getting his life together. And I completely understood where he was coming from. I was supportive. I'm like, all right, bro, go ahead and do you. I support you. Go and do you. I did not have a problem with him stepping away from hanging out with us for a while, so that way he could get his life back on track. And then Randall, not to his face, but in private to me, his reaction was, Marcel wasn't being a brother. Yeah, he'd be like, oh, Marcel hasn't been a brother lately. And I was like, what are you talking about, man? You know, like that's when I first started seeing another red flag, you know, because it seemed to me that Randall was disappointed that Marcel decided to not hang out with us for a period of time. And it wasn't like a long time. It was like a month or two that he stepped away from hanging out with us so that way he could go handle things. Because during that time, you know, Marcel got a job and he was starting to make improvements to his life. And, you know, Randall just had an issue with that. And I kind of feel like Randall took that as betrayal and he felt abandoned by Marcel. And it bothered me that he kind of felt that way about it. And I told him, I'm like, dude, it's not even about that. You know, like he's been through a lot of shit because, you know, Marcel had a rocky relationship with this one chick and it kind of fucked him up emotionally. And, you know, like I said, he lost his job at McDonald's. So Marcel was kind of like in, you know, floating around. You know, he wasn't really, you know, like basically he was kind of stuck in this rut and he made the moves to get out of it. And I kind of feel like Randall just didn't give a shit. You know, he just kind of, you know, focused on more like what he felt about the whole thing. He didn't care how Marcel felt. You know, he just wanted Marcel around him to make himself feel better. And I did not really like that, you know, but, you know, it is what it is. But this part right here is going to be crucial to what I talk about next. All right, so gotta get into this next part because this is kind of the tipping point that changed everything. You know, it changed everything between Randall and I and changed everything between Randall and Marcel. And this is... I don't really like talking about this part because it was hurtful, you know, to not just me, but to Marcel as well. And this girl, I'm going to call her Sarah. Sarah was like a sister to me at one point in time. You know, I knew her, you know, I worked with her mother, Karen, who I mentioned earlier. So yeah, like she felt like a little sister to me. And, you know, she trusted me with some personal stuff and, you know, and I felt like she was someone I could trust as well, you know. But Marcel liked Sarah a lot. And he wanted to be in a relationship with her. And they were talking. And what was going on behind the scenes was that Randall was starting to manipulate Sarah. Like he was like telling her things like, oh yeah, Marcel would not be a good guy for you because of these reasons. And, you know, basically kind of putting things in her head. You know, he was manipulating her. And then, you know, and then weird things start happening. Like I was home by myself one day. Randall, he was doing something. I don't know what he was doing, but he was off doing whatever. And then Sarah shows up at my apartment. You know, which is, I mean, she knew where I lived, but, you know, she wasn't there to see me. She was there to see Randall. And then that's when I kind of felt like things wasn't adding up, you know? And, so she comes over and, she's like, oh, hey, is Randall here? And I'm like, no. And they're like, oh, well, do you know when he's going to be back? And I'm like, no, he just told me that he was doing something and then, he'd be home later. So I don't know where he's at. I don't know what he's doing, you know, because I guess that, she was under the impression that he was going to be there at my place and they were going to hang out. But, you know, she showed up there and he wasn't there and, you know, she was kind of confused. And then, so she decided to just, you know, sit with me and talk for a little bit. And then she left. You know, she kind of got tired of waiting around for Randall. So she decided that she was just going to go home. And I thought, I'm like, man, that's kind of fucking weird, you know? Then I started hearing things that Sarah and Randall had sex. And it was getting around work. You know, that's what was going on. And I was like, what the hell? You know? So I asked Randall straight up, I'm like, hey, did you and Sarah have sex? He told me no. It didn't happen. You know, yeah, nothing happened, you know, and that the rumors were not true. So I took Randall at his word. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. And I even asked Sarah, like, hey, I'm hearing things, you know, is this true? And she said, no, you know, Randall and I are just really good friends. So I gave her the benefit of the doubt too. And then Marcel also heard these rumors because he knew a lot of the people that worked at McDonald's and they were most likely telling him this stuff. So Marcel asked me, like, hey, man, is this true about Sarah and Randall? And I told him, like, look, man, I confronted Randall about it, and he told me that nothing happened. So I'm going to take him at his word, and then nothing ever happened. And then Marcel was like, okay. And then the rumors kind of started intensifying a little bit. And then I was kind of getting a little pissed off about it because I'm like, look, either these two are lying to me about it and they want to keep it a secret, or, you know, somebody wants to kind of, you know, drive a wedge between Randall and Sarah. I mean, it even got to a point like one day, like Randall and I almost got into a fight about this. Because I just was getting frustrated and I just had this feeling that something wasn't adding up, you know? And then I was talking to Sarah and then she started feeling guilty about stuff. And then she eventually came clean and she admitted that her and Randall had sex. And once I found out that happened, I was pissed. So pissed off. Because I felt like, you know, I could trust both of them and they just lied to me and kept it a big secret because they didn't want me to find out because I would tell Marcel. Because you're damn right I'm going to tell Marcel about it because, you know, Marcel was talking to Sarah and they were talking about getting together. And then Randall came in and he fucking squashed it pretty much. So yeah, I was upset about it. But Sarah told me, like, look, I liked Marcel, but it just never was going to work out between us. You know, I just don't feel the same way that he does, you know, and plus my mom doesn't like him. But, you know, I was more so mad at Randall than I was Sarah. But both relationships changed. And so the main issue, I think, wasn't who slept with who. It was more so the issue was being lied to about the whole thing. So now, gotta get into the confrontation with Randall. You know, because I found out from Sarah that about what really happened. So I said, like, I got to do this. You know, I got to confront Randall on his lie and everything. So, you know, he came home and I said, you know, Randall, we need to talk because I know the truth, dude. You know, I know that you and Sarah fucked. I know you guys had sex and you guys both lied to me. And I'm not cool with it because, you know, you know that you knew that Marcel liked her and wanted to be with her. And then Randall somehow managed to take this whole thing and flip it upside down because he started to have a mental breakdown in front of me. And, you know, he told me straight up, and this is an exact quote from Randall himself. He told me that he wanted to kill himself, that he wanted to commit suicide, but the only reason why he didn't was because I would never recover. That's what he said. As a direct quote. That he wanted to kill himself, but the reason why he wouldn't is because I would never recover. And at the time, I didn't know if he was truly in crisis or if he was trying to avoid accountability. I mean, I know Randall had mental health issues just like I did. But at the same time, I'm just wondering if he was trying to get out of this by telling me that, so that way I wouldn't ream his ass over this whole thing, or if he was truly having a mental breakdown. So my reaction, I didn't know what to say. Honestly, I didn't know what to say because I could not believe that he was telling me this. I mean, it's one of those things where someone tells you that and you're just like, you don't know how to process that. To this day, I still can't really process what he was really feeling in that moment. I don't know. I honestly don't know. You know, I've been alive for 35 years and I've, you know, heard a lot of things over the years, and, you know, I've had people tell me some deep stuff, you know, and usually I have like sympathy and I feel for the person. But in this particular instance, I'm truly stumped on how to really feel about the whole thing, even to this day. All right, this next part right here is the bed bug incident. Yeah, this is where the living situation between Randall and I fell apart. Because like I said, Randall was living with me, and this was happening after the whole situation blew up with confrontation. We had a bed bug problem. And if you ever had bed bugs, you know, they're a pain in the ass to deal with. They're hard to get rid of. They were mostly coming from his stuff, like his bedding, his stuff. But I discovered one bed bug that was on my bed, and I killed it. And then Randall and I started having a disagreement over where the bed bugs were coming from. But here's the thing. He even told me that the bed bugs, that they had bed bugs at his brother-in-law's house. And then it got to a point where he was insisting that they were coming from my couch. But I believed that they were coming from his belongings and bedding. Because bed bugs can transfer everywhere, dude. Like you could be in a place, and someone who has bed bugs on their stuff, they can hitchhike and, transfer themselves onto your stuff, without you knowing about it. It's weird how bed bugs work and everything. But, one day I was at work, I was working a closing shift. So I wouldn't be home until like after midnight. But yeah, Randall wanted me to burn my couch. Because in his mind, that's where he thinks that the bed bugs were coming from. Even though he had slept on this couch multiple times. Ate on this couch and we chilled on the couch and everything, and he never once had a problem with it. But, all of a sudden he just had this crazy theory that the bed bugs were coming from my couch. And they were not. But anyways, yeah, I was working the closing shift. I come home, and everything that Randall owned was gone. Like his bed, his guitars, all of his stuff was gone. And nothing was stolen of mine. He left all of my stuff intact. But everything that he owned was gone. And there was no fight, no warning. I came home from work, and our friendship was basically sitting on the curb. Pretty much. But yeah, he decided to move out without telling me. There was no confrontation, no warning. And it was over me not wanting to burn my couch. Because he thought that I had bed bugs coming from my couch when I didn't. Because after he moved out, the bed bug problem was gone. Didn't have a single one after that. Because we bombed the apartment. We got those bug bombs that you let off, and then it's supposed to release the chemicals and everything to kill them off. We did that. We bought those, and then we set them off, and then we left the apartment for a couple hours and came back, and then apparently it was still a problem even after that. So, but yes, but yeah. He decided to move out. All right, so this right here is an important part of the story because we tried. Marcel and I, we tried. So Marcel graduated from high school, and people might be like, oh, he graduated from high school. Well, Marcel, he was, 19 years old, almost 20. He was kind of, late getting into school and everything, but, that's not important, he graduated from high school, so he had his graduation party, which was at his mom's house. We did it in the backyard, and we actually invited Randall. We extended the invite to Randall to come over and, hang out with us at the graduation party, and he came over, and, everybody was trying to be adults, trying to move forward. And our hope was, maybe we can get things back on track. Maybe we can repair the relationship that had been damaged. That was our hope, that we could get things back on track, that we could begin back to being friends, that we could, work through this, because, I thought to myself, I'm like, look, I don't know where things exactly went wrong, but we can still fix this. And Randall came over, and like I said, we had a good time together, but little did we know in that particular moment that it would be the last time we would all hang out together and have a good time. So about a week after Marcel's graduation party, and at this point, Marcel and I were living together. I moved out of my apartment. I decided to move in with him, and we moved into the Sycamore apartments. It's a fourplex. Yeah, because it was a big house, but it was divided up into 4 different apartments. And so he and I were living together in one of those. And I texted Randall and I asked him to come over with the goal in mind for him and Marcel to sit down together and, just have an opportunity to clear the air about everything, about the situation with Sarah, the lie, just getting together and talking about it. And, I wanted Randall to apologize to Marcel. I wanted him to say, bro, I fucked up. I'm sorry. What I did, it was terrible. I was selfish, and I'm sorry. That's all I wanted for him to do, was to apologize to Marcel, and then we could get past this, and, we could get back to being good friends, being bros like we were before, and, just getting back to that point. But what Randall's response is what made the friendship end. Randall refused to apologize to Marcel, and he felt like he did nothing wrong in this situation. Even though he lied, even though he went behind his friend's back and fucked the girl that Marcel wanted to get with, he felt like that he did nothing wrong by doing that. And then at that moment, I realized that we weren't arguing about what happened. We were arguing about whether anything happened at all. It was almost like he was trying to gaslight me, into thinking, oh, well, nothing bad happened, really. It was just what happened. Sarah and I fucked. It's not that big of a deal. It's like, the bond and friendship and brotherhood that we all developed, it meant nothing to him. And then he threw that all out the window. And he didn't even take Marcel's feelings into account about the whole thing. So at that time, I just got to that point where I said enough was enough. I cut ties with Randall altogether. I said, we can no longer be friends. I told him I would rather have Marcel as a friend than have him as a friend. Because Marcel would never do some stuff like than what he did. So So yeah, it was done. I told Randall, you know what, man, good luck in your life. And, I wish you all the best. So Randall and I were done. I told Marcel what he said. Marcel was pissed because he was owed a serious apology from Randall, and Randall was selfish and didn't want to give it to him because in his mind, he felt like he had done nothing wrong. Yeah, that was a really difficult period of time for sure. Because in what would follow is, people found out that Randall and I weren't boys anymore because of that whole thing, and then they all took Randall's side on the situation. I'm like, are you guys kidding me? Like, do you not realize that morally he was in the wrong here? Like, I could not believe people were just taking his side, knowing everything that he's done. But, he was good at that. He was good at the manipulation. He was good at the lies. And he even told Marcel at one point, I can be a very good liar. All right, so let's talk about more so Randall's music career after he and I stopped being friends because, I was around for a lot of those shows that he had. I was at the Angola shows. I was at the, the Decatur shows, the Salina shows. I was around him when he was just a solo act. And, we had conversations that when he was really starting to take, his next step in his career, that he was pretty much going to make me his roadie and his manager. So yeah, I mean, we had some serious conversations about that. But after he and I stopped talking, we decided to end the friendship. Randall decided to go from a solo act to forming a full band. So Ellis Omega became a band rather than just a solo act. And then he recruited Matt King, who I'll be talking about here in a minute. Matt was a mentee of his brother Colt. Yeah, Colt Burnett, he's the front man for the band Colt and Crew and Van Wert. He's also in some other bands too. But yeah, Colt taught Matt how to play the guitar and basically everything that Matt knows about music, Colt taught him. So Randall recruited Matt, and then he recruited his best friend, Tame Shytower, and then Tame talked to Randall about bringing along his girlfriend at the time, Megan, or she was also referred to as Meggie. So, we had the full band. We had Randall, Matt, Tame, and Meggie. And then they released the EP October, and the main single from that EP was Submerged. And Randall talked about Submerged in great detail with me, and I even gave him, advice on how the tone of the song should be, and yeah, so I was kind of like one of those creative forces, behind the song, but that's beside the point, because after October got released, Matt was fired from the band. Yeah, Randall kicked Matt out of the band, and basically Randall said it was an image thing because he decided to remove Matt from the band, and then he brought in this other guy, which I think this other guy was there before Matt was removed, but then this other guy just ended up taking over Matt's spot. And Matt was, understandably pissed, because, he was there when the band formed, and now all of a sudden he's not in it anymore because of an image thing, which I thought that was the lamest excuse that you could give somebody, just to kick him out of your band. But yeah, Matt was pissed, and he wanted to speak publicly on my podcast about his removal from the band. Yeah, he wanted to do it and everything, but Matt ultimately decided not to do it. Because he was afraid that because Randall knew some people in kind of like in that Fort Wayne region music scene, that, it would basically fuck with Matt's career and everything. And that Matt said that somebody from Randall's camp one time sent somebody to video Matt performing, because I think Matt was performing with Colton Crew at a show. So he said that Randall sent somebody there to film Matt, which I thought was just stupid, like, really. But yeah, I felt bad for Matt because I feel like he got railroaded there and he did nothing wrong, and Matt, he was there for some of those shows that Marcel and I went to. And yeah, I just kind of felt like he got railroaded as well, so, the point is that Randall's actions affected a lot of people, not just me, not just Marcel, not just Sarah or Emily, but also Matt and other people as well. All right, let's talk about some instances looking back with older eyes now. I was 27 when I was around Randall, and now here I am at 35. So I'm just looking back at some certain situations with older eyes now. So let's go to a particular Angola show. Because like I said, Randall had shows at a coffee shop from time to time in Angola, Indiana. Well, this one particular instance, he brought along this girl, and I'm going to call her Ashley. So, Ashley came with us to this Angola show. And she was 15 years old, and I thought that was fucking weird. And the way that Randall tried to spin it was that, I've known her brothers for years, blah, 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 it's all good. But I just did not feel comfortable with this at all, But, she was riding in Randall's car, and I had my group of people that I was taking with me and everything. So, yeah, we rode up to Angola. He did his show. And then we went to Steak and Shake afterwards, and we ate, And then after the show was over, or after we ate at Steak and Shake, we all went back to Van Wert. And then Matt, Marcel, and I went back to my place. And then Randall had to drive Ashley home. And me, Matt, and Marcel, we were just chilling at my place. And Randall took a long time to get back to my place. And we're like, where the fuck is he at? Come on, man. It's late. I want to go to bed, but we also want to hang out and shit and talk about the show and everything, So yeah, he was taking a long ass time to get back to my place from dropping Ashley off. And what I found out And again, this is me finding out after the fact that the reason why it took Randall so long to get back from from dropping Ashley off was because this Ashley girl was giving him a blowjob. Yeah. I wasn't really too thrilled about hearing that, but what's done is done. It's disgusting. And then there's the New Year's Eve thing. So this was, I think, New Year's Eve 2017, maybe, or 2018. I think it was 2017. So New Year's 2017, I had invited quite a few people, Randall and I did. Randall invited some of his friends over. I invited Marcel over, but Marcel didn't make it because he fell asleep and everything, so he wasn't able to make it. I had a girl coming over, that, I just recently started talking to. So I invited her to the New Year's party, and she agreed to come over. And then Randall had this girl come over, and I do not remember her name, so I'm just going to call her Megan. I don't remember her actual name. I honestly don't. It's been so long ago. So, yeah, I'm going to I'm going to refer to her as Megan for this particular part. And Megan was another young girl, about 16 years old, and she was hanging out with Randall and everything. And then, the girl I was talking to came over. We all had been drinking and stuff like that, having a good time. Well, not the young girl. No, she wasn't drinking at all. She was just hanging out while everybody else was drinking and everything. And I even told Randall ahead of time, I'm like, dude, what is this? What, why is she here? It's like, oh, I'm just hanging out with her. We're just friends, man. Nothing crazy's going on or anything like that. And I'm like, whatever, dude, because I just felt like there was more to it than he was telling me. But yeah, when the ball dropped for New Year's, he tried to kiss this girl on the lips, and she was not cool with that. Like, she kind of was just like moving away from him as he was trying to kiss her and everything. And I'm like, what the fuck? But, as I look back on this whole thing, him being with these younger girls and everything, and then the whole Emily situation, I just kind of feel like a sense of guilt that I didn't do more to kind of protect the girls that were involved. I knew deep down something was wrong, but like I said, with us smoking, getting high, drinking all the time, and, just wanting to believe that, it's a phase, or, just not wanting to believe the worst in your friend. You kind of try to give them the benefit of the doubt. But in hindsight, when I look back at it, like, Randall had a problem. He had a fixation on underage girls, and it's gross and it's disgusting. Totally disgusting. But yeah, I wish I would have done more back then, but like I said, sometimes in your friends, you don't want to believe the worst in them. And then you eventually realize that there was a problem. A big problem. All right, so after all that, and like I said, I've reflected on this whole thing before, I want to talk about what I've learned from this whole experience. Lesson number 1, trust your instincts. If you think something's wrong, if you have this gut feeling that something's not right, listen to it. Trust your instincts, trust your gut, because more often than not, you're right. So yeah, trust your instincts. Lesson number 2, friendship shouldn't require you to ignore the red flags. Yes, I Randall threw a lot of red flags in my direction, and, I ignored some of them, and it was because I had a good friendship with him, or so I thought, and, I kind of, wasn't seeing clearly until the very end. But yes, even though you're friends with somebody, if you start seeing red flags, don't ignore them. See them for what they are and confront it. Don't ignore it. Lesson number 3 is that loyalty and accountability can exist together. So basically, you can be friends with somebody and still hold them accountable for their actions. So even though, you have this friend and, you have this great friendship with them and you love them as a person and you're loyal to them, you can still hold them accountable for the things they're doing wrong. Because, in life, we need to be told when we're fucking up. You got to be told when you're doing shit wrong, and, there's nothing wrong with friends holding friends accountable for their actions. And then lesson number 4 is that people can hide parts of themselves. And that's what Randall did. He was a manipulator, a liar, and he had this weird fixation with underage girls. And, for the most part, he hid a lot of those parts of himself until, you saw it firsthand. So, yeah, just be wary of that. And then lesson number 5 is that you can't carry responsibility for every decision that someone else makes. And more so, I'm talking about myself. I can't carry this burden, these old feelings, anymore because of the decisions that Randall made. I'm letting it go. What happened, and I was not responsible for what happened. I grew up, I moved on, and he has to live with his mistakes. And the last lesson that I learned is that growing up means revisiting old chapters honestly. And I feel like that's what I did here. I revisited this chapter of my life as, very honestly, and, taking a look at everything that happened from an older point of view. And I feel like, I've grown exponentially since then. Looking back at what happened in 2017 and 2018 to now, you're seeing right now a very different person than I was years ago. So let's bring everything full circle. I don't hate Randall. I really don't. He was a friend of mine. He was a brother to me. We were close, and, we had some good moments together as friends. But yes, I don't hate Randall Burnett. I don't. I hate some of the choices that he made. And I hate the pain that those choices caused. And I hate that there are moments I wish I understood sooner. But this story isn't about him anymore. It's about what I learned from it. But guys, that is it. That is everything. And I'm hoping that you guys got a lot out of this podcast. I feel like this was a real and honest take from me about an old story. But it's simply that now, an old story. This was more so a reflection, not a hit piece. And, there's going to be some things in here that people are going to look at and be like, oh my God, but yeah, it wasn't a, it was just a reflection of an event that happened in my life. And I'm hoping that you guys got some good things out of it. And now I can finally close this chapter up in my life. And now let's move forward. Thank you for listening and watching this episode of the Cody Springer Show. And stay tuned for future episodes of the podcast. And I will talk to you all very soon.